Everyone on the Westfield ranch had heard the stories. Diablo wasn't just any stallion. He was the kind of animal that turned strong men into stammering cowards. A beast bred for greatness, purchased for a record-setting sum, and now practically rotting in the shadows of the isolation barn. The staff called him cursed, the trainers called him a lawsuit waiting to happen, and Camilla Westfield. She called him her biggest mistake, until that night. It was just past sundown, and the ranch was quieting down after another long day. Trucks rolled out, stable lights dimmed, and the heavy silence of Montana's plains settled over the land like a blanket. But Camilla wasn't ready for rest. Wrapped in a cashmere shawl, her wineglass untouched beside her, she stood on the wraparound porch of her estate, gazing across the vastness of what she'd built. Her eyes flicked to the far edge of the property, to the old stable no one went near without orders, Diablo's stall. That's when she saw him, a figure in a faded jacket and worn boots, walking with slow, easy confidence. Jake Lawson, the new hire from 3 weeks ago. A quiet man with a resume so thin her HR team had nearly tossed it. The only reason he was on payroll was because he'd showed up in person, looking her straight in the eye and asking for a chance. She'd given it, barely. But what was he doing now, at this hour, headed straight for Diablo's stall? Camilla leaned forward, curiosity tightening in her chest. Diablo was dangerous. He didn't tolerate people. He didn't allow proximity. The last handler had spent 2 nights in the ICU after trying to check his hooves. No one went in that stall alone. No one except Jake, apparently. She watched, heart rate rising, as he unlatched the gate, not flinching, not hesitating, just stepping inside like the stallion wasn't a ticking time bomb. For a moment the world held its breath. Then something unexpected happened. Diablo didn't charge. He didn't rear or scream. He lifted his massive head and snorted once, deep and uncertain. Jake didn't reach for him, didn't lift a halter or crack a whip. He just stood there, whispering. A low murmur, too soft for Camilla to catch from the porch, but steady and sure like he'd known the stallion for years. Diablo's ears flicked back and forth. His hooves shuffled. The muscles in his neck twitched. Camilla braced herself for an explosion, but instead, Diablo took a step forward. It wasn't much, just a single, cautious step, but to Camilla, it was earth-shattering. That horse had done nothing but rage since the day he arrived. Every trainer, every technique, every promise of results had failed. She'd spent more on his conditioning than on her own private jet upgrades, but in just 3 minutes of silence and presence, Jake Lawson had done what no one else could. Camilla couldn't look away. She gripped the porch railing so tightly her knuckles whitened, blood pounding in her ears. She should have called out. She should have yelled for security, told Jake to back away before something snapped, but something stopped her. The stallion was trembling now, not in fear, but something else. Relief? Recognition? His head lowered inch by inch until it hovered just in front of Jake's chest. Jake moved, finally, just a bit. He lifted his hand, slowly, open palm, waiting, not demanding, not taking, offering. And Diablo, unbreakable, volatile, furious Diablo, closed the distance. He pressed his nose into Jake's hand with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul, a sound Camilla had never heard him make, software trusting, human. She swallowed hard, blinking against the sting rising behind her eyes. For a woman who ran her life by the numbers, who negotiated contracts with billionaires and closed land deals before breakfast, this moment made no sense. It couldn't be measured, it couldn't be planned. And for the first time in a very long time, Camilla Westfield had no idea what came next. Only that she had just seen something she would never forget. The next evening, Camilla told herself she wasn't watching. She had contracts to review, a quarterly report to finalize, a dinner reservation at the golf club with a senator's wife, things that belonged in her world, not whatever strange, quiet spell Jake Lawson had cast in that stable the night before. And yet, as the sun slipped beneath the horizon and the sky turned to dusk, her gaze drifted, almost unwillingly, back toward that distant barn. Her dinner sat untouched, Her phone buzzed and she ignored it. Because there he was again, Jake, walking with the same calm gait, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, heading straight for Diablo's stall as if it were just another evening walk, as if the beast inside wasn't a legend in violence. This time, he didn't go straight in. He leaned on the fence beside the stall, looking up at the sky for a long moment, then said something, again too quiet to hear from this distance. It wasn't just Diablo tonight. Camilla watched closely as Jake moved from stall to stall. There was an old mare named Whisper, half lame and deemed unfit for breeding. She usually backed into a corner when anyone came close, ears pinned, eyes wild with distrust. But when Jake stopped by her gate, she came forward, not fast, not eager, but she came. Then came Bramble, a skittish gelding who'd flinched at his own shadow since the day he arrived. Jake didn't open the gate. He just crouched in front of it, elbows on his knees, talking. And Bramble, the horse, lay down, right there in the straw, just folded himself into the bedding like he finally felt safe. Camilla had overseen hundreds of horse evaluations. She'd sat through presentations by elite behavioral specialists, purchased technology that promised data-driven emotional insight, even paid a firm to conduct a psychological audit of her livestock. But never, not once, had she seen this. No tools, no force, just presence, just Jake. That night, after the lights in the barn finally dimmed and Jake disappeared into the shadows, Camilla found herself sitting at her desk long past midnight, a glass of untouched wine still sweating onto the leather coaster. Her laptop was open, not to the quarterly earnings spreadsheet or her investor call prep, but to the security feed from Stable D. She clicked back through the footage, again and again, frame by frame, watching the horses shift from agitated to calm in Jake's presence, watching how he never pushed, never hurried, never even touched them unless they asked for it first. She zoomed in, heart tightening for reasons she didn't care to name. There was something in the way he stood, something utterly unshakable. His posture wasn't casual or cocky, it was steady, intentional. And the animals, the broken ones she'd written off in red ink as financial losses, were responding to him like they'd been waiting their whole lives for someone to understand them. Somewhere between 1 and 2 a.m., she reopened his employee file. Sparse, deceptively simple, no certifications, no letters of recommendation, just a few lines about small ranches in New Mexico, Idaho, Oregon. No titles, no honors, just the work. Nothing on paper explained what he was doing in her stable, how he was reaching horses that her most expensive staff had given up on. She remembered the first day he arrived, quiet, polite, asking for the worst jobs with zero complaint. He mucked stalls without being told, showed up early, left late. Most men like that faded into the background, but Jake Lawson didn't fade. Not anymore. Not after what she'd seen. Not after the way Diablo had pressed his massive head into his chest like a frightened child finding a parent. Camilla leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling, overwhelmed by something she couldn't categorize or control. She'd built this ranch into one of the most respected breeding and training programs in the country. She knew bloodlines like a gambler knew odds. She'd outbid kings for stallions and buried competition beneath her boot heels. But none of it had reached these horses the way Jake had. And not once had he tried to draw attention to it. He hadn't looked toward the cameras, hadn't looked up at her balcony, hadn't acted like he was performing. He just showed up, night after night, in silence, in service. And for reasons she couldn't yet admit aloud, Camilla Westfield suddenly needed to know why. Why he could do what no one else could. Why he didn't demand credit. Why he moved like someone who had nothing to prove, and yet changed everything without saying a word. She closed the laptop gently and sat there in the quiet. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't comforting. It felt like something waiting to be broken, like the space between breaths before a question you're afraid to ask. And she knew somehow that if she didn't ask it soon, she might miss the one thing she'd never been able to buy: truth. The next morning, Camilla didn't wait for the sun to climb high over the Montana hills. She was already in her office early, dressed in her signature dark riding jacket, perfectly pressed, her hair tied back in the no-nonsense braid she wore whenever something serious was about to happen. On her desk was Jake Lawson's personnel file, still thin, still irritatingly unremarkable, as if it refused to tell her anything useful. But Camilla didn't need a file to confirm what she'd seen. She needed answers, and Jake was going to give them. She summoned him with a simple message: "Report to my office." Immediately. No details, no explanation. She wanted to see how he walked into a room when the stakes were unclear. She wanted to see if he flinched under pressure. Most people did. That was half the reason she built the office the way she did. Tall ceilings, cold stone, massive windows that flooded the space with light and made everyone who stood before her desk feel small. It was a room designed to remind people who held the power. Jake didn't seem to notice. When he walked in, he didn't shuffle or glance around nervously. He didn't admire the awards on the wall or the skyline through the window. He looked straight at her, calm and unreadable, the same way he looked at her horses. And for some reason, that unsettled her more than she expected. "You know why I called you here?" she asked, keeping her voice cool, clipped, professional. He shook his head. "No, ma'am." That was it. No attempt to flatter, no anxiety, just steady quiet. "I've been watching you," she said. "You and Diablo, you and Whisper, Bramble, all of them." Still, he didn't react. Most men would have looked surprised, flattered, or panicked. Jake looked neutral. "What you're doing with those horses," she continued, "is unlike anything I've ever seen. And I've hired Olympic medalists. I've paid fortunes for trainers with bloodline reputations longer than this rancher's deed." She paused. "How?" Jake shifted his weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but as if weighing how much to say. Then, finally, he answered, his voice low and even. "I just listen." Camilla frowned. "That's not a method, that's not a system." "It's the only one that works," he said, gently but firmly. "You can't force a horse to trust you, no matter how much money you throw at them. They know, they feel it. The ones that come here, most of them aren't broken the way people think. They're scared. They've been misunderstood, overridden, abused even. And you don't fix that with pressure. You fix it with time and respect." She hated how much sense that made. She hated that it sounded like something she should have known long ago. "I didn't bring you in for philosophy, Mr. Lawson. I'm running a business. These horses are assets, investments. When they don't perform, we lose money, we lose contracts, we lose value. And when they're treated like machines," Jake said, "you lose them anyway." His tone hadn't changed. Still calm, still respectful. But his words landed like hammer blows. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. No one talked to her like that. Not on this ranch, not in that office, not ever. And yet, she didn't throw him out, because he wasn't wrong. She turned to the window, staring out at the paddocks where her empire unfolded in symmetrical lines of fencing and order. "Let's cut to the point. I want to offer you a position, head trainer, full control of your methods. You report directly to me, 6 figures. Housing on the property, assistance of your choosing. And if it works, I'll fund whatever expansion you need. We'll rebrand the training program under your name." The silence behind her was thicker than she expected. Finally, Jake spoke, and his voice was quiet enough that she had to turn to hear him. "No," she blinked. "Excuse me?" "I appreciate the offer," he said, steady as ever, "but I'm not interested." Camilla's jaw tightened. "You haven't even heard the number." Jake gave her a look, not defiant but sad, almost disappointed. "I've heard enough to know what matters to you." Now she was angry. "Don't presume to know what matters to me, Mr. Lawson." "Then ask yourself," he said, "why you're really making the offer. Because if it's about results, you've already got them. If it's about the horses, they don't need a head trainer. They need someone who sees them." Camilla stared at him speechless. The audacity, the nerve. And yet, the truth in every word. It shook her, not because he insulted her, because somewhere deep down it felt like he was right. She tried to recover. "You expect me to run a charity? Turn this place into a sanctuary for lost causes?" "I don't expect anything from you," Jake replied. "But you asked my price. That's it. Respect, patience. Let them heal instead of forcing them to perform." It was madness. It was business suicide. And still, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Diablo had leaned into Jake's hand, the way Whisper had stepped forward, the way Bramble had laid down like he was finally safe, all without a single dollar changing hands. She crossed her arms tightly, shielding herself from something she couldn't name. "You think you can fix them all with kindness?" "No," Jake said, "but I can give them the space to find their own strength again." She hated how much she wanted to believe that, and maybe that was the most dangerous part. Not that Jake was idealistic, but that he made her question everything she'd believed about value, about control, about success. She'd built this empire from nothing. She knew how to win. But right now, sitting across from a ranch hand in worn boots and a soft voice, Camilla Westfield felt like she might be losing something far more important and not even know how to fight for it. She turned her back to him again, arms braced on the desk, her voice quiet and tight. "Get back to work, Mr. Lawson." Jake paused, then gave a single nod. "Yes, ma'am." When the door closed behind him, the room felt colder than before. She stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he'd stood and wondering, for the first time in years, if maybe the thing she needed most couldn't be bought at all. The call came just before midnight. Camilla had been in her study, still awake, of course. She never slept well, not with deals pending, board members breathing down her neck, and now the strange turmoil stirring inside her since her conversation with Jake. She'd replayed every word over and over, like an itch under her skin. His refusal hadn't just surprised her, it had stung, not because of the rejection itself, but because it forced her to confront something she'd spent decades avoiding, that there were people and moments and truths that simply couldn't be bought. She was still staring at the same spreadsheet she hadn't updated in over an hour when her phone buzzed across the desk. It was her son, Liam. Her heart dropped. Liam never called her this late, not unless something was wrong. The moment she answered, she didn't hear his usual calm voice. She heard panic. "Mom," he said, breathless, "it's Apollo. Something's wrong. He's not moving right. He won't eat. He collapsed." Everything stopped. Apollo wasn't just any horse. He was Liam's pride, his first jumper, a birthday gift Camilla had spared no expense to acquire, a $150,000 gelding with flawless bloodlines and Olympic potential. Camilla had flown in specialists from across the country to oversee his training, but none of that mattered now. Apollo was down. He was thrashing, and Liam, her son who rarely showed fear, sounded like a child again. 20 minutes later, Camilla was at the stable. She hadn't bothered changing out of her cashmere loungewear, throwing a coat over her shoulders as she rushed to the barn. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, harsh and sterile, washing the scene in cold brightness. Apollo lay in his stall, lathered in sweat, his muscles twitching violently, his eyes rolled white, his nostrils flared in terror. Liam stood to the side, pale and shaking, murmuring to the horse through clenched teeth, helpless. Dr. Greer, the on-call vet, had already arrived. "Vitals are erratic," she reported grimly. "We've administered a sedative, but it's barely touched him. Whatever's going on, it's deep, neurological, maybe even trauma-triggered." Camilla's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Not this horse, not her son. She turned to Greer. "Try a higher dose." The vet hesitated. "At that level, we risk respiratory failure." "Then find something else," Camilla snapped. "Do something." But Greer had already tried everything. The vet's eyes told her the truth. They were out of options. Liam pressed his hands together like a prayer. "Mom, please." And then, quietly, from the stable entrance, came a voice. "Let me try." Camilla turned. Jake stood there, still in his worn flannel, dirt streaked from the day's work, and yet somehow calm in a storm no one else could weather. He didn't wait for permission. He stepped forward, slowly, like he wasn't approaching a million-dollar animal mid-crisis, but a friend in need. Apollo thrashed again. Camilla instinctively moved to block Jake. "You'll get hurt," she warned. "That horse is dangerous right now." But Jake only looked past her, eyes on Apollo. "He's scared, not dangerous. Let me help." Dr. Greer gave a reluctant nod. "Frankly, he's the only one we haven't tried." Jake crouched just outside the stall, not entering, not yet. His voice was low and steady. "Hey there, fella. You're all right. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but you are. You're not alone." The words were nothing special, simple, ordinary, but the way he said them carried weight, like he wasn't trying to fix anything, just to be there with Apollo in the dark. He didn't move closer, didn't demand contact. He simply talked. About the wind in Wyoming, about the stars overhead, about a stubborn mare he once knew who hated thunderstorms. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Apollo's legs stopped thrashing, his breathing slowed, his ears twitched forward. He turned his head, one trembling movement at a time, toward Jake's voice. And then the unthinkable happened. The horse, still trembling but no longer wild, rose, slowly, shakily, but under control. Liam gasped. Camilla gripped the stall door. Jake didn't flinch. He stood, hands still, voice calm. "That's it. There you go. You're safe now." Apollo stepped forward. Not toward Camilla, not toward the vet, but toward Jake. His head dropped against the man's shoulder, and for the first time that night, the stable went quiet. Camilla didn't realize she was crying until Liam's arm brushed against hers. She wiped her face roughly, ashamed of the emotion that had broken through the stone exterior she'd so carefully cultivated. Jake moved to step away, but Camilla reached out and stopped him, not with a command, not with authority, but with a whisper. "Thank you." He looked at her, really looked at her, and nodded once. Sometimes they just need to know someone sees them. She didn't know if he was talking about the horse or about Liam, maybe even about her, but the words hit her with such force it was like someone had dropped a weight into her chest. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she thought money could protect, Camilla Westfield understood something terrifying and beautiful, that trust couldn't be bought, and that sometimes the most broken ones are the ones who teach you how to heal. Later, after Apollo had been checked and stabilized, and Liam finally allowed himself to cry in relief against his mother's shoulder, Camilla watched Jake walk away down the dimly lit barn corridor. His shoulders were square, but his pace was slow, like he carried not just the weight of the night, but the weight of every scar he didn't speak about. And for the first time since the day her husband died, Camilla didn't feel powerful. She felt human. That, she realized, was a far scarier kind of strength. The sun hadn't even risen when Camilla walked into Stable D the next morning, her heels echoing against the concrete like a metronome counting down the end of something she couldn't yet define. The horses were still asleep, the world outside painted in steel gray. Everything was quiet, still, except for the knot in her stomach. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but the empty air that greeted her when she reached Diablo's stall hit harder than it should have. The gate was locked, the straw freshly raked, the water bucket filled, but Diablo wasn't looking at the door like usual, waiting for the morning chaos. He stood turned away, motionless. His massive shoulders drooped like he knew what she hadn't yet confirmed. Jake was gone. She didn't say anything, didn't even call for staff. She just stood there in the aisle, not quite willing to accept what was obvious. Then her eyes fell to the hay bale beside the wall, where something rested that hadn't been there yesterday, a single leather work glove. Worn down, frayed at the fingertips, the kind that had held countless lead ropes, wiped down damp foreheads, coaxed fearful horses into trust. It wasn't forgotten. It was placed, deliberate, a message. Camilla picked it up carefully, as if it might disintegrate in her hand. The leather was warm from the sunbeam breaking through the stable window, but still held the chill of departure. She turned it over once, twice. No note, no explanation. And yet it said everything. She didn't need to ask anyone. Jake hadn't left in anger. He hadn't stormed off after their conversation or tried to prove a point. He had simply gone, quietly, the way he came, as if to remind her that not everything required fanfare. Some goodbyes weren't loud. They just echoed in the places where a presence used to be. Camilla walked back through the barn in silence, the glove still in her hand, her mind running through the last few weeks like a reel she hadn't paid enough attention to the first time. The quiet moments she'd dismissed, the subtle things Jake had taught not through instruction, but by existing. The horses knew. They always knew. Diablo watched her leave the stable that morning with eyes that didn't just recognize her. They questioned her, as if to ask, "What will you do now?" She made it halfway to the main house before she stopped, unable to keep walking. Her breath caught in her throat as the weight of it all slammed into her. Not just the loss of a ranch hand. It wasn't that simple anymore. Jake hadn't just changed a horse. He had changed her son, changed the way the staff moved through their routines, changed the energy in barns that had once been full of tension and ticking clocks. He had changed her, though she'd been fighting to deny it since the moment Diablo had touched his palm. Back in her study, she opened his employee file again, even though there was nothing new in it. She read the same line over and over. No formal certifications. She whispered it aloud like it might rewrite itself if she said it enough. But the truth was already carved into her memory. Jake Lawson had done what none of her polished trainers, her imported consultants, or her prized professionals could do. And he did it with nothing more than time, stillness, and heart. She looked out the window at the paddocks, her empire as she used to think of it. Fences aligned like equations, horses trotting like clockwork. But now it all felt different, lifeless somehow. Like she had designed a stage set without a script. She had spent years making sure the ranch ran like a machine. But Jake had reminded her that a living thing is not a line item. And now the one person who carried that truth-like instinct was gone. The worst part wasn't that she'd lost him. It was that she hadn't stopped him. She could have. One word, one gesture, and he would have stayed. But she had done nothing. Pride had stood in the doorway and let him walk away. Later that afternoon, Liam found her in the feed shed, somewhere she hadn't set foot in years. She was sitting on an overturned bucket, elbows on her knees, staring at the glove she hadn't put down since sunrise. "He left," Liam said, already knowing the answer. Camilla nodded, didn't even say goodbye. "He didn't have to," her son replied, quieter now. "He didn't think you wanted one." Camilla swallowed hard. She should have known, should have seen it coming, should have done something. "He did more for this ranch than anyone I've hired in the last decade," she murmured, "and I let him leave thinking none of it mattered." "You still have a choice," Liam said, kneeling beside her. "He hasn't gone far." But it wasn't about distance, it was about damage. Jake hadn't left because of the job or the pay, or even the confrontation in her office. He left because Camilla had offered him everything, except what mattered most: respect, trust, the space to simply be who he was. And now the glove in her hand felt heavier than any trophy she'd ever lifted, because it wasn't just a piece of leather. It was a reminder that the greatest thing she'd ever had on this ranch wasn't an asset. It was a man who asked for nothing but to be heard, and left when she couldn't give him even that. And now, standing in the shadow of her perfect barns and her flawless reputation, Camilla Westfield realized the empire she had built was sturdy, yes, but hollow. And all the money in the world couldn't fill the space that Glove had left behind. The first thing she did was call her assistant and cancel everything. The meetings, the auctions, the networking brunch in Bozeman, all of it. The woman on the other end of the line sounded stunned. Camilla Westfield never canceled anything, not even when she buried her husband. not even when her son totaled his car during finals week. But today, she needed silence. Not the kind filled with spreadsheets and shallow conversations, but real silence. The kind where she could finally listen to the question that had been building inside her since Jake walked away. What did I miss? By late morning, she was in the archives room, pulling up records on every trainer they'd ever hired, every incident filed involving the horses Jake had somehow connected with. Diablo, Whisper, Bramble, and Apollo. She read injury reports, vet notes, security logs. It all pointed in one direction. No one had ever really tried to understand these horses. They were approached like problems to be solved, liabilities to be mitigated, investments to be salvaged. But Jake had seen them differently, not as problems, but as creatures worthy of patience, of dignity, of time. That afternoon she drove herself to town, something she hadn't done in months. She stopped at the public library because she knew exactly what she was looking for, and she didn't trust her staff to find it. A scandal, a past, the question that had been hovering at the edge of her curiosity since the moment she opened Jake Lawson's bare bones. Resume. Something had to explain why a man with that kind of gift wasn't running his own operation, why he came to her with nothing but calloused hands and a quiet soul. She found it in less than an hour. It wasn't front-page material anymore, but it had been once. A headline from 5 years ago: Silver Creek tragedy, 6 horses dead, head trainer terminated. There was a photo. Younger, clean-shaven, but unmistakably Jake. She read every word. The official version was simple. Jake Lawson, newly promoted to head trainer, had allegedly ignored early signs of illness in several horses at Silver Creek Ranch, one of the most prestigious breeding operations in Kentucky. Within 2 weeks, 6 animals had died. The media had latched on like sharks. Silver Creek had issued a swift and tidy statement. Jake was fired. No legal charges, but his reputation shattered. He disappeared from the industry after that, until now. Camilla sat back, stunned. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone and dialed her ranch manager. "Howard, I need everything we have on Silver Creek. Feed suppliers, shipping records, cross-reference anyone who's ever worked there with who we've hired. I want it today." "Yes, ma'am," Howard said, not even pretending to understand why. But she didn't owe him an explanation. Not yet. Later that night, she poured herself a drink she didn't touch and opened her laptop. Not to check her financials, not to prepare for the European buyers flying in next week, but to dig deeper, to follow every thread she could find. And what she found changed everything. There were whispers in old forums, archived vet boards, obscure blogs from ex-staffers who no longer worked in racing. Patterns began to emerge, comments that mentioned contaminated feed, hidden test results, a rushed auction schedule that coincided with the horse's sudden decline. And always, the same name behind the cover-ups: James Montgomery, Silver Creek's owner, a man who prided himself on spotless reputation and brutal efficiency. But what caught her breath was one post in particular, buried deep in an old stable-hands forum, dated the day after the final horse died. Lawson tried to stop it, told them something was wrong with the grain. Nobody listened. I heard him threaten to call the board. Next morning, he was gone. They said he cracked under pressure. That wasn't what happened. He took the fall for all of us. Camilla read that sentence 3 times, then leaned back in her chair, the air thick and heavy. It all made sense. Jake had kept quiet. Not because he was guilty, but because someone had to. Because speaking up would have taken others down. People with families, people who couldn't afford to lose their jobs. So he walked away. Let the story shape itself. Let the world assume the worst of him. And all this time, she'd judged him by the same headlines he never bothered to correct. She closed her laptop and stared out the window. The barn was lit faintly in the distance, a dull glow from the overnight staff making rounds. She wondered if the horses felt it, his absence. She wondered if Diablo was still waiting for him in the silence. Most of all, she wondered what it must have cost Jake to carry the burden of those lost animals, those ruined reputations, those quiet sacrifices, and still choose to show up at her ranch with nothing but a steady hand and a quiet voice. The next morning, she didn't wait for her driver. She didn't alert her staff. She took her own car, a black SUV she rarely touched, and drove west. She'd heard whispers that Jake sometimes stayed near the mountains on his days off, a quiet place past the canyons where no cell towers reached. She didn't know exactly where he'd gone, but somehow she knew she'd find him. As she drove, the road winding beneath a sky just beginning to blush with morning, the glove sat on the passenger seat beside her, a reminder, a challenge, and a question that hadn't left her mind since she first saw Diablo bow his head. What kind of woman builds an empire only to realize too late that it's hollow without soul? She didn't know what she was going to say when she found him. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, Camilla Westfield wasn't chasing a deal or protecting her name. She was chasing the truth. And if she was lucky, she wasn't too late to make it right. She didn't find him on the first day, not the second, either. Camilla drove farther west than she'd gone in years, beyond the reach of reception, where paved roads turned to gravel and gravel to dirt, and the silence of the landscape pressed in like something ancient and alive. She stayed in a tiny cabin with no heat and no one who recognized her last name, eating pre-packaged food and rising before dawn to follow trails that looked more like game paths than anything meant for cars. The ranch back home ran without her, though her phone buzzed with updates she didn't answer. She knew Howard was probably losing his mind. Clients, buyers, her assistant, even Liam, they'd all left messages, but none of it mattered right now. The empire could wait. She wasn't searching for a man to bring back to work. She was searching for something she'd lost long before Jake ever set foot on her property, her own willingness to be wrong. It was on the fourth morning, after a night spent half awake in a borrowed cot with an aching back, that she saw the cabin. It wasn't on any map, tucked between two craggy hills and wrapped in cottonwood trees like the world had decided to hide it. There were hoof prints in the mud out front, fresh ones, deep from a large animal. She parked the SUV at the base of the rise and walked the rest of the way up. No plan, no practiced words. Just the glove in her coat pocket and the pounding truth in her chest that she might be too late. She knocked once, twice, no answer. She was about to turn away when she heard a low whinny from around the back. She followed the sound to a small paddock where a lone mare stood, thin and sorrowful, her coat dulled and her eyes distant. She didn't react to Camilla's presence until another figure stepped out of the shadows beside her. Jake. He was brushing the mare gently, murmuring something low that Camilla couldn't hear. He didn't look up right away, but when he did, his expression didn't change. No surprise, no irritation, no anger, just quiet recognition. He finished his stroke and gave the mare a pat before turning to her. "You found me." She nodded, unsure whether to be proud or ashamed. "You weren't easy to track down." "I wasn't trying to be," he said, not unkindly, "but you came anyway." Camilla stepped closer, the chill biting her cheeks. "She's beautiful," she said, nodding toward the mare. "Hope," Jake replied, "lost her foal 2 months ago. She stopped eating, stopped trusting. People tried everything. Vets, supplements, other horses. Nothing worked. Just needed time. Needed to know someone wouldn't give up on her." The words landed hard. Camilla knew he wasn't talking just about the mare. She looked down at her hands, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the glove. "You left this." Jake studied it for a long moment before nodding. "Didn't want to take anything that didn't belong to me." "It did," she said quietly. "More than I realized." They stood in silence for a long stretch, broken only by the rustle of wind in the trees and the mare shifting her weight in the straw. Camilla drew in a shaky breath. "I read everything about Silver Creek, the feed contamination, the horses. I know what they did to you, and I know what you did to protect the people under you. You didn't lose those horses. You tried to save them. You took the blame so others wouldn't have to." Jake didn't deny it. He just looked at Hope and nodded once. Some things aren't worth explaining if nobody's ready to listen. I'm ready now, Camilla said. Too late maybe, but I'm here. You didn't come to offer my job back, did you? His voice was quiet, measured. No, she said, voice catching. I came to ask you to teach me. That stopped him. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even hope. She stepped closer. I've spent my life building something I thought mattered. Horses with papers and prices, ribbons on walls. But the first time I saw Diablo press his head into your hand, I realized none of it meant anything if I didn't understand what made them trust, what made them feel safe. You showed me how wrong I've been, and I want to learn, if you're willing to teach me. He was quiet for a long time. Hope shifted beside him, her breath a soft cloud in the morning air. Then, finally, Jake gestured to the gate. Come in, but don't try to touch her. Camilla hesitated, then obeyed, stepping carefully into the paddock. She stood beside him, hands at her sides, still as she could manage, the way he'd once stood with Diablo. Hope watched her, uncertain but curious. Jake didn't speak for a while. Just let the moment stretch, let the quiet settle. And then he said, First lesson, let go of the clock. You don't rush trust. Camilla nodded. The wind tugged gently at her coat. Her breath curled into the air, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't thinking about her next meeting or her public image or her profit margins. She was thinking about the slow, impossible task of earning something priceless. They stayed that way for a long time, unmoving, until Hope took one tentative step forward, then another. She didn't reach for Camilla, but she didn't back away either. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't closure, but it was a beginning. As the sun rose, streaking the sky in colors that looked like possibility, Jake turned to her and said, Tomorrow, before dawn. We start with the stallions. Thunder still has a lot to teach. Camilla met his gaze, and for once she didn't feel the need to prepare or perfect anything. She simply nodded. I'll be there. And she meant it. The first rays of morning light barely touched the windows of Camilla's office when she arrived, but the room felt colder than it had in years. The polished mahogany desk she'd spent so many years behind, the awards on the wall, the leather chair that once felt like a throne, all of it felt different now, like a facade. Camilla stood there for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk, staring at the empty chair across from her, knowing the man she was about to face wasn't someone who could be controlled by anything she owned, not by her reputation, not by her money, not by the position she'd offered. The quiet of the room hummed in her ears, louder than it should have been. She wasn't used to waiting. She wasn't used to feeling unprepared. Jake had agreed to meet her here, but he didn't come rushing in, didn't arrive with any air of excitement or pride. When the door finally opened, he walked in with the same calm, almost hesitant manner she had come to expect from him. No grand gesture, no arrogance, just quiet certainty, like he'd known all along where this conversation would lead. He didn't even glance at the lavish space, the same way he never looked at her money, her power, her status. He looked only at her, and it was that gaze that unsettled her more than anything, because it was filled with patience, not expectation. He wasn't here to win her approval. He wasn't here to fight for anything. He was here because she had asked him to be. "Have a seat," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She motioned to the chair across from her, still hoping to maintain the upper hand, even though deep down she knew the game had already shifted. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, taking in the space, the windows that overlooked the vast stretch of land she had cultivated, the trophies and accolades that lined the shelves like markers of success. And then, as if everything in this room meant nothing, he finally sat, his posture still as grounded as ever. "Camilla," Jake said quietly, his voice still carrying the same warmth that had soothed so many animals, and for some strange reason, it worked on her too. "You don't need to offer me anything." Her fingers clenched slightly on the edge of the desk, but she controlled it. "You're wrong about that," she said, her voice more forceful than she intended. "I do. And I'm offering more than just a job. I'm offering you the chance to do what you've always wanted to do, the way you want to do it." He raised an eyebrow but didn't respond right away. His hands rested on his lap, palms up, as if he were ready to listen, but not necessarily to speak. His patience was maddening. Camilla tried again, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't do this the way she had done everything else in her life, by dictating the terms. She couldn't force him into her world the way she had forced everything around her into neat, profitable boxes. She had to ask him, not demand. "I've spent my entire life building this place," she began slowly, her gaze moving to the window, not wanting to look at him directly as she spoke. "Everything I've ever done, every choice, every dollar I've spent, has been to create something of value, something untouchable. But the truth is, I've never seen it clearly. I've been too focused on profits, on power, on winning." She paused, taking a breath. "I've neglected the heart of what matters, the soul of the ranch, the horses, and I've seen what you've done, what you've been able to do with them. I've never understood it, and I want to. I want to understand it, Jake." She finally looked at him, her eyes meeting his. "I know you've been hurt. I know what happened at Silver Creek, but I also know that you didn't walk away from those horses because you couldn't handle the pressure. You walked away because you were protecting people. You were protecting the ones who couldn't protect themselves, and you did it without asking for anything, without asking for credit." Jake's gaze softened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he just nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that she was getting it, finally, that she had started to see. "I'm offering you something different this time," Camilla continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I'm offering you trust. You don't have to prove anything to me. You don't need to fight for anything. I'm offering you a chance to take this ranch, to take me, and teach us how to truly care for the animals, how to build a sanctuary, not just a breeding operation, a place where trust is the currency, not control, where the horses aren't assets to be managed but spirits to be understood." Jake was quiet for a long time. The tension between them stretched, but she didn't back down. She let the silence settle, because in that space she knew he was deciding something much bigger than any contract or proposal. He was deciding whether or not he could trust her, whether the heart she was offering was real, or whether it was just another business transaction disguised in different words. "I know that's a big ask," Camilla said finally, breaking the silence. "But I'm asking because I want it. I need it. I need you to help me fix what's broken, not just with the horses, but with me." Jake's eyes met hers, and for the first time Camilla saw something shift in him. It wasn't just acceptance, it was the beginning of trust. But there was still a hesitation there, a part of him that wasn't ready to believe that someone like her could change, could walk away from the hard, unyielding lessons of control and money that had shaped her for so long. "You don't know what you're asking," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a note of something softer, almost regretful. "You've built your life around something I've spent my whole life running from. I can't make you into something else. I can't teach you patience in a few lessons. I can't teach you how to listen, and I won't do it if it's for any reason other than that you want to learn." "I want to," Camilla said firmly, her eyes never leaving his. "I want to learn, Jake, but not just for the ranch, for me. I've spent too many years being the kind of person I thought the world needed me to be. And it's hollow. You were right. You were right about everything. I've been running a business, not a home, and I've missed what matters. I've missed everything. I don't want to do that anymore." Jake didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, studying her. But Camilla didn't look away. She held his gaze. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She wasn't offering him a choice between her version of success and his version of healing. She was just showing him the truth that had been hiding behind walls for years. She wanted this to be different, not just for the ranch, but for herself. Finally, Jake leaned back in his chair and sighed. "All right, Camilla," he said quietly, his voice softer now. But don't think it's going to be easy. Don't think for a second it's going to be quick. And don't think that one offer can change everything. I know it won't, she said, her voice steady, but it's a start, and it's enough. Jake nodded. We start with trust, and that means everything else will follow. He paused, his gaze softening. I'll teach you, but it's not just me doing the work, it's you too. She nodded, the weight of his words settling into her bones. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to control everything. For the first time, she felt like she was ready to trust. The weeks that followed were a blur of dust and sweat, of early mornings spent in silence, of breakthroughs and setbacks that stretched Camilla's understanding of what was truly important. She had come to the ranch every day, not just as the owner, but as a student, working alongside Jake, watching the way he moved, the way he spoke to the horses, the way he could see what no one else could. The mornings began early, before the sun had even broken over the horizon, and she would find herself waiting outside the stable, hands in her pockets, just as Jake had once stood with Diablo. He'd given her the space to learn, not by pushing her, but by guiding her through the quiet moments. It wasn't the flashy techniques or the overwhelming presence of a trainer calling all the shots. It was the silence that spoke the loudest, the patience, the time. Every day she saw the horses respond. Diablo, once the embodiment of rage and fear, now greeted her with soft eyes and a steady presence. He followed her with a trust that no amount of money or reputation had ever been able to buy. And it wasn't just him. Whisper, the mare who had once been too terrified to be approached, now sought out Camilla's touch when she entered the stall. Bramble, the gelding that had flinched at every sound, now stood still, allowing Camilla to groom him without fear. It was slow, it was subtle, but it was undeniable. The ranch had started to change. The horses were becoming more than just assets. They were becoming something else, something real, something alive with potential, not for profit, but for something deeper. The change wasn't just in the horses. Camilla felt it within herself too. For the first time in years, the weight of expectation and perfection that had once driven her to build this empire, that had turned everything into a transaction, began to lift. It was terrifying, it was freeing, it was everything she had never allowed herself to feel. The walls she had so carefully constructed around herself, walls of control, of ambition, of power, were beginning to crack. And with each crack, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope she had when she was building her empire, when everything was about the next deal, the next win. It was the kind of hope that asked her to trust in something bigger than herself, something that wasn't measured by numbers or success, but by connection. But there were moments when that hope felt fragile, when the fear of failure whispered in the back of her mind, reminding her of everything she had built and everything she stood to lose. The ranch was still her responsibility, still her livelihood, and the buyers from Europe were scheduled to arrive in just a few weeks. Her pride, the same pride that had once driven her to the top, still weighed heavily on her, reminding her that the world was watching, that her reputation was built on the belief that she controlled everything. There was a part of her that still feared that letting go, that truly embracing the lessons Jake had taught her, would destroy everything she had worked so hard for. And then came the moment that tested her more than anything had before, the day the buyers arrived. They were not just any buyers. They were the kind of clients who demanded perfection. They had seen the ranch's reputation. They had heard the stories of the horses bred here, of the legacy Camilla had built. They expected the finest, horses with the highest pedigrees, the most pristine bloodlines, the ones that could command the highest prices, and it was all on Camilla's shoulders to deliver. As the buyers walked through the paddocks, inspecting each stallion, each mare, the weight of their judgment pressed on her chest. She had prepared for this day with the same precision she had prepared for every deal. The horses were ready, the paperwork was ready, the pitch was ready. But as the buyers made their way down the rows, inspecting the animals with their calculating eyes, Camilla couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. They were looking at the horses the way they had always looked at them, through the lens of profit, of breeding value, of their worth on the market. But Camilla saw them differently now. They weren't just animals to be sold. They weren't just investments to be traded. They were lives. They were souls. And as she watched the buyers inspecting each horse with cold detachment, something inside her snapped. She couldn't do it. She couldn't sell these animals like this. Not after everything she had learned. Not after the way they had transformed, not just for the betterment of her business, but for the betterment of her soul. She wasn't going to stand here and pretend that these horses were commodities to be bought and sold. They had become something more than that. They were living, breathing beings with value that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Without thinking, Camilla turned to Jake, who had been standing at the edge of the paddock, observing the buyers. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. But in that moment, there was no hesitation. She knew what she had to do. "Stop the sale," she said firmly. Her voice carried across the paddock, loud enough to catch the buyers' attention. "I'm not selling these horses." The buyers paused, exchanging looks. Camilla's heart raced, but she stood her ground. Jake took a step toward her, his expression still calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Pride, perhaps, or understanding. But Camilla didn't need to explain herself to him. She turned to face the buyers, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. "I've spent my entire life building this empire on the belief that everything has a price, that everything can be bought and sold. But I was wrong. These horses are not for sale. They are not just investments. They are not commodities. They are living creatures with souls, with trust, and that is not something that can be measured or sold." There was a long silence, the buyers exchanging uncertain glances. One of them, a tall man with a sharp suit, stepped forward. "You can't be serious, Camilla," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've built your name on the value of these animals, on their bloodlines, on their pedigrees. You can't just throw that all away." But Camilla didn't flinch. She was done pretending. She had learned the hard way that the world was never going to hand her what she truly needed if she kept playing by their rules. She had spent too many years following the money, following the path of least resistance, believing that control and power were the only ways to win. But now, she saw that true success didn't come from building walls. It came from breaking them down. It came from trusting in something bigger than herself. "I'm not throwing it away," she said, her voice steady. "I'm building something new, something that matters. I don't need your approval to know that this is right." Jake stepped forward, standing beside her, and the weight of his quiet presence gave her strength. The buyers hesitated, unsure of how to respond to the unexpected turn of events. But Camilla didn't care. She had made her choice. She was done compromising. She was done measuring everything in profit and loss. She was going to build something different, something real. And as the buyers turned and left, leaving behind a ranch that no longer fit the mold they expected, Camilla stood there, the sun shining down on her, feeling lighter than she had in years. For the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing something. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply living, breathing, and trusting that the right path would unfold in front of her, step by step. The ranch, her home, her legacy. It was no longer defined by the numbers on a spreadsheet or the reputation she had built for herself. It was defined by the love, the trust, and the connection she had learned to nurture. And that, she realized, was worth more than anything money could buy. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity, but they didn't feel like the frantic rush of her old life. The steady rhythm of the ranch, once driven by the ticking clock of deals and deadlines, now unfolded at a different pace. It was a pace dictated by the horses, by the quiet moments Jake had taught her to savor, and by the steady growth of trust that blossomed not just in the animals, but in herself, too. The ranch was still a business. Camilla would never deny that. But it had become something more, something that went beyond profit margins and breeding lines. It had become a sanctuary, a place where healing wasn't measured in dollars, but in the quiet moments between a person and an animal. And that was worth more than she had ever realized. But as much as she had changed, there were still challenges to face. The world outside her ranch was watching. Her investors, her competitors, the ones who had built their empires the same way she once had, on numbers and control. And while they couldn't understand what she was doing, they weren't about to let her walk away from what she had spent a lifetime building. The offers came in, one after the other, bigger ranches, larger stakes, higher profile contracts. But each time, Camilla found herself saying no. Not because she was afraid of the opportunities, but because she had finally understood what mattered most. She had a new foundation now, one built on trust, on love, on understanding. It was fragile, yes, but it was also unshakable in its own way. The biggest test came a few months after the buyers from Europe had walked away, disappointed by the lack of horses on the market. Camilla had seen the whispers, the rumors. They called her foolish. They said she had lost her edge, that her refusal to sell had cost her the kind of deals she'd spent years chasing. But Camilla didn't care. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need the validation of those who didn't understand what she was building. She had Jake, she had the ranch, and most importantly, she had herself. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Camilla found herself walking through the paddocks with Jake. The horses were already winding down for the evening, the grooms were finishing their rounds, and the ranch was settling into its usual peaceful rhythm. But Camilla couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her life, something that was both terrifying and beautiful. She had made her choice. She had chosen a different path, one that didn't rely on the old rules, the old ways. But now, as she walked beside Jake, feeling the weight of everything she had learned, she realized that there was one final question she had to answer. She stopped, turning to face him. The sun bathed his face in warm light, highlighting the quiet strength that had always been there, the calm that had never wavered. He looked at her, waiting for her to speak, as though he already knew what she was about to ask. "I want to make this official," she said, her voice steady but filled with a deep sincerity. "I want to partner with you, not just with the horses, but with everything. We've built something together here, and I know it's just the beginning. I don't want to go back to the way things were. I don't want to run this place like I used to, but I need you, Jake. I need your guidance. I need your vision." He didn't say anything at first, and for a moment Camilla wondered if she had said the wrong thing. But then he stepped closer, his presence steady and sure, and placed his hand on her shoulder. "You've already done it, Camilla," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You've already made the change. You don't need me to tell you what to do. You've found your own way, and that's all I ever wanted for you." Her heart swelled with something she hadn't expected. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, something that felt like love, but not the kind she had once known. This was different. This was a love rooted in respect, in understanding, in the kind of bond that couldn't be bought or sold. This was a partnership built on trust, not just in each other, but in the future they were creating together. She nodded, the weight of the decision settling into her chest. "I know," she whispered, "but I want this to be real. I want to share this with you. Everything we've built, I don't want to carry it alone anymore." Jake smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and softened the lines of his face. "It already is, Camilla. It's real." And just like that, Camilla knew that everything had changed. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty that had once ruled her life, they were gone. In their place was something much stronger, a quiet certainty that the right path had always been there, and she had finally found it. The ranch, the horses, her legacy. It wasn't about power anymore. It wasn't about control. It was about something far more precious. It was about understanding, about healing, about love. The next few months passed in a blur of work and quiet growth. The ranch continued to thrive, but not in the way it once had. There were no grand announcements, no high-profile sales. Instead, there were small moments of connection. a trainer gently coaxing a skittish horse to trust, a young girl learning the patience of grooming a horse for the first time, the steady rhythm of hooves on the dirt as the horse is exercised, not as athletes, but as living beings with stories of their own. It was these moments that defined the new legacy of the ranch, not the accolades or the trophies. And Camilla, standing on the balcony one evening, watching the horses in the paddocks below, finally understood what it meant to be truly free. She wasn't tied to the past anymore. She wasn't chasing something that could never be caught. She had everything she needed right here, a life built on trust, on healing, on connection. And with Jake at her side, she knew that no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it. Together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Camilla felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've made the right choice, from trusting your heart even when the world around you doesn't understand. And in that moment, standing beside the man who had taught her how to listen, how to heal, and how to love, Camilla knew that this was just the beginning. The true work was only just beginning, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to face it, not with fear, but with hope.